thus our speaker today. Andrés Gómez Emilsson is the President Director of Research at the Qualia Research Institute, whose very narrow and pedestrian mission is to develop a precise mathematical language for subjective experience, understand the nature of emotional valence, map out the full space of possible conscious experiences, and build tech to improve the lives of sentient beings. So, not particularly ambitious, but we love to have him here anyway. It's clearly a joke, right? Okay. Andres' work at QRI ranges from algorithmic design, psychedelic theory, neurotechnology development, and mapping and studying computational properties of consciousness. So we're gonna run this a little bit more informally than we do with some of our other fireside chats. If anyone has questions, I'm going to pass around or have available a microphone so that the people who are on our stream today, which includes our forum organizers who unfortunately couldn't make it, but so that they can hear you as well, and then we'll just kind of dive deep into the weird, you know? But anyway, thanks for joining us, and take it away.
Fantastic. Yeah, well, thank you, everybody. Yeah, I'm very happy to be here. Truth be told, usually, the situation is sort of like I talk about these subjects, whether people want it or not. So it's very nice, okay, you guys are probably interested in this subject, so I don't have to worry about that. Well, the first thing I'll actually mention, and unfortunately the people who are in video won't get to experience these fully. Of course, actually they can get the recipes and do so, but so I think just a kind of very, very beginning introduction, a very big component of intelligence that is usually neglected from the point of kind of a theory of intelligence is the capacity to instantiate, understand, navigate, and explore aspects of consciousness. So, you can have a definition of intelligence that is being able to solve differential equations, or, solving analogies in language or something like that. Solving an IQ test or something like that. But actually there's so much more to it, right? Empathetic ability, for example, is enormously cognitively demanding, and it's not just, let's say, the agreeableness facet of personality. And essentially I think when it comes to saying new, meaningful, non-trivial things about consciousness, that is probably one of the features of intelligence that is going to take the longest for AGI to actually get right? So, you can explore a lot of things with a large language model. I'm sure you guys have been playing with ChatGPT maybe 5 hours a day or something like that for the last couple of weeks, right? But you can learn a lot about, let's say, Turkish cuisine or something like that, something that there's a lot of written stuff online. But can you learn anything about, for example, what happens when you combine DMT and ketamine? Not really, right? They actually don't have that information, and if you want to learn something new and meaningful about it, you have to have somebody who's really dedicated to figure out okay, what structural features of consciousness can they actually say that are useful or interesting or algorithmically relevant. And that, I think if you want to have a safe job that's not going to be taken over by AI for a while, probably being a rational scientific psychonaut will actually be a pretty good bet. Well, okay, in that vein, nothing as radical as DMT, but I'm going to show you one facet of a scent that I find fascinating. So as part of the fundraising campaign of QRI, the end of 2022, you can actually get 6 of our what I call magical creatures, which are scents that essentially have really special effects. It's kind of Pokemons. If you know that there is, let's say, fire, water, grass Pokemons, you cannot infer from first principles that there's going to be a Pikachu, an electric type Pokemon, right? It's kind of it comes completely out of the blue. Or let's say ghost or psychic Pokemon, right? Completely new categories, what's going on with that? I would say that when it comes to scents, it's something like that, right? You've smelled violet, you've smelled rose, lavender, but if you have never ever smelled anything minty, you wouldn't be able to infer from first principles well, hold on a second, there's actually a cool scent out there, something that actually feels cooling. So I'm just going to show you two scents. One of these is just a pure molecule. It's called a ambroxan. which is something that essentially is almost flavorless, but if you mix it with any other scent, it has the very strange property that it smooths it out and takes off the harsh edges of it, almost kind of like without adding any flavor to it. But it's very interesting to smell it on its own, because it's kind of this very, very subtle but clear kind of like lubrication of the olfactory bulb. You'll see what I mean. So I'll just spray it a bit and like pass it around. So this is, it's called ambroxan. It's very common in perfumery. Like the 90s had like a bunch and bunches of super heavy ambroxan scents. So like smell it and pass it around. And this is like, what you're smelling is literally just like ambroxan diluted in alcohol, in like ethanol. It's like extremely simple. But it has kind of like that like soft, ambery, very, very subtle, very subtly sweet. But the sweetness and the amber quality are actually almost irrelevant. It's really the softness that is like so mysterious and fascinating. Now, the next one that I'm going to show you is actually one of the scents that you can acquire at qri.org/scents. This one is called glacial gumdrop. So essentially, this scent is essentially something that I developed that does two interesting things. The first one is like it's a very cooling scent. Again, you wouldn't have been able to infer that there is such a thing as a cool scent, right, in advance. But it also has another very strange property, which is it feels gummy, right? Like some scents, some rare scents, like marigold, aranone, sometimes bergamot, have kind of like a strange gummy quality. And this one essentially combines the two. It's kind of like a cool, gummy effect. So let's see what you guys think. All right, so we're going to spray 4 of them. All right, so here's one. And yeah, and pass them around. So glacial gumdrop.
Gummy, yeah.
Right, what's up with that? It's kind of like bouncy. I don't know, like, yeah.
Yeah, the smell is like the sensation of having a big wad of mint gum in my mouth.
Yeah, it's not just cold, right? It also has like.
It's a good description. Yeah.
And the cold aspect is not that mysterious. Actually, coldness in scent can be explained in terms of increasing the threshold temperature for cold receptors to get activated. The gumminess, I think, is beyond our current science to understand. Nobody knows what's up with the gumminess quality. Okay, so that's a little bit of a very, very maybe unexpected type of introduction, but it does get at kind of like what I'm going to be talking about, which is like in what sense consciousness is related to intelligence. And again, if you really want to say something new and meaningful about sense, you actually have to experience it. Have kind of like a conceptual framework, the ability to compare sense. And I think like ultimately one way to test consciousness will involve, can somebody make inferences about the state space of consciousness based on other experiences? Can they say something new and meaningful about it? Even you can maybe even standardize it with something I call phenomenal puzzles. And we can talk about some specific phenomenal puzzles if you guys are curious. And we can test if you guys are conscious. That would be an option. Okay, so I think like I saw those slides from like philosophy and AGI that I think you guys saw. So I saw that you covered Mars levels of analysis. So that's like very, very important. Just as a recap, any information processing system can essentially be analyzed with kind of like these 3 levels. In truth, there's many other levels. There's many other like lenses with which you can kind of approach an information processing system. But these are kind of like 3 very helpful complementary levels. So the first one is the computational level. Essentially, what is it that the system is doing? Ultimately, it comes down to like what is the input-output mapping and how long does it take to transform the input into the output? Of course, yeah, with kind of like AI technologies, you would describe them in terms of like what is it that it's doing, right? It's like, well, you give it a prompt and it generates a picture that approximates that prompt. It's kind of like this very high-level understanding. And some people, let's say behaviorists, have this theory that, the computational level of analysis is all you need to determine if something is conscious or not, right? Like just looking at it from the outside by its, external behavior, like, okay, it acts conscious, it must be conscious. I really don't think that is the case. I think you can fool people with this. And the absolutely simplest way of like showing you that this is the case is that you can essentially create something that looks conscious from the outside with literally just a lookup table. Now, in general, it's going to be impractical, but you can think of it almost as kind of like a probabilistic lookup table that sometimes it gets it right, and it's going to fool some people in some circumstances. So just having kind of like an external behavior, kind of like appearance of being conscious, I don't think it's enough. Obviously, it's going to be very impractical to have a lookup table that literally, simulates like a chatbot and is like very convincing. But it's something that at least in principle is possible, right? And that fact is like something to bear in mind, that it's in principle impossible. In principle, it is possible, and a lookup table, I think like there's a really strong argument for like why a lookup table cannot be conscious, and that is that it simply does not have enough information content inside as a state to capture the meaning of what it's talking about, right? So you need at the very least some kind of like richness of variety of possible internal states that encodes enough information to have like some basic understanding of what it's talking about. And a lookup table just doesn't have any information inside. It really is just like a map from input to output. Now there's like the second level in Mars levels of analysis is the algorithmic layer, which is not only the input to output mapping, but also like how it is accomplishing it. Essentially, what kind of data structures, what kind of algorithms, what kind of interactions between data structures, what kind of memory systems it has. And for any given input-output mapping, there's many algorithms that can take you there. Now, a functionalist, and I think you guys saw functionalism today, would actually say that as long as you have an isomorphism between the functional level, you will essentially be able to have consciousness. That really what matters is kind of like not necessarily the behavior from the outside, but it's also kind of like the behavior from every kind of like cut you can do in the system. Where like, okay, like from this point of view to this point within the system, the input-output mapping is the same. In other words, like the internal functions are being preserved. And I would argue that that also is not enough for consciousness. But it sounds very strange why it's not enough. Because all of a sudden, if I'm saying like, okay, functions are not enough to explain consciousness, it sounds like this entails what is called epiphenomenalism. That is the idea that like, actually consciousness is not doing anything, right? Like, if I can show you two systems that are functionally identical, so to speak, it would be very weird that one is conscious and the other is not conscious, because there's no test that you can apply to one that is going to differentiate it from the other. So what is going on, right? Like I would essentially say like, okay, I'm actually going to steel man the case that functionalism is not the case, because there's a critical insight that is still missing from this perspective. So for that, we need to understand like the last layer, which is the implementation level of analysis in Mars level, is not only what algorithm you're applying, but it's also how it is implemented at the physical level. Are you using like transistors? Are you using neurons? Are you using buckets of water? Now, traditionally, and this I think is kind of like the missing piece of information in a lot of these models, is traditionally the way Mars levels of analysis are conceptualized is that every layer in some sense is under constrained by the layer above it. In other words, for any given input-output mapping, which is the computational level, there's like many algorithms that could satisfy it. And for any given algorithm, there are many implementations that could satisfy it. And so it's kind of like a funnel. You're right, like the range of possible implementations is enormous for a particular input-output mapping. But if you actually look at like what's going on in physics, it's not so clean-cut. Actually, there is another very important component, which is that there is interactions between levels. This is the most clear when it comes to quantum mechanics. Now, I haven't studied very deeply quantum computing, but I can tell you that there are like some algorithms that are very specifically designed for quantum circuits, where actually having qubits allows you to essentially achieve like better runtime complexity that would be possible without them. And so, of course, you can simulate a quantum computer using a classical computer, but you cannot do it with the same criteria that a functionalist would say that it would satisfy essentially being functionally equivalent. Why? Because at some point, actually, you're going to be having an imperfect runtime complexity match. In other words, as you scale up, how many qubits you need to simulate, at some point, the simulation is going to break down. Essentially, it's going to take exponentially longer to simulate. And so you actually have like a situation where understanding the implementation level constrains what kind of algorithms are possible or practical. So what I'm going to claim is that actually consciousness is something that is relevant at the implementation level that makes some algorithms a lot easier, a lot more efficient. And that is why we are conscious. Like the reason why evolution recruited states of consciousness is that they can accelerate some specific computations. Now, the full argument is actually kind of subtle because you can bring up the concept of epiphenomenalism again. But I can kind of like give you the rough sketch of how all of this works out. So for that, we need to have a discussion about the binding problem. So are any of you kind of familiar with the concept of the binding problem? I talk a lot about it on my videos on Twitter, but tends to be like a fairly neglected question.
Several members of the stream say yes.
Excellent, excellent. Fantastic. All right, so I don't need to explain it. Well, okay, so the binding problem, to a first approximation is, how is it possible that 100 billion neurons, give or take, that are spatially distributed in your brain can simultaneously contribute to a unified state, such as your moment of experience right now? Okay, so there's like many ways to approach these. The most typical among software circles, based on previous experience, is to deny it, is to say, well, actually, how do you know that you have like a unified state of consciousness at this point, right? Because, well, your attention is kind of like zooming in and out and painting the picture here and there and here and there. In what way is this kind of like an integrated whole? Daniel Dennett would actually say like, no, the integration of consciousness is completely illusory. Actually, you just have like a patchwork of algorithms that are loosely causally connected, and maybe from a certain point of view, it kind of feels like, kind of looks like that there's like some kind of unity. Well, I don't think that really works, because for anything to have any meaning whatsoever, like for anything to be more than just a point, for you to have like the meaning of a hand or the meaning of, let's say, a square, you need to have some minimal amount of feature integration that you experience at once, at a glance, essentially what is called experiencing a gestalt. Now, I think there's actually quite a bit of personal variability in how much the concept of experiencing gestalts is accessible. So hopefully this doesn't get me in trouble, but like I've seen some kind of like variability in, let's say, like very right brain versus left brain people, where very, very left brain people may actually have kind of like much more of a sensation of their experience as being very point-like, where like they're paying attention to only one part of it at a time. Whereas let's say very right brain people kind of like experience all of their experience at once and kind of like, okay, there's a gestalt, there is a vibe to it. And you can modulate it with substances and meditation, and like it becomes clearer. I've definitely experienced a lot of people say like, I had no idea what you were talking about, the binding problem, then I took LSD and like, okay, I got it. Like that's not that unusual actually. And yeah, things like psychedelics modify how binding happens, and modify patterns of binding, things like dissociatives as well, and definitely on meditation as well, in predictable and fascinating ways. So let's get into like a little bit better, kind of like more in-depth vocabulary here. So first of all, there is what's called global binding. Global binding is the mere fact that two specks of experience, two qualia, are participating into the same experience. So, if you have a kind of like a piece of audio and a speck of your visual field, the fact that they're part of the same experience means they're globally bound. There's something that is making them part of the same experience, such that like that audio, that quality of audio is not part of my experience, but it kind of like belongs to you in this point in time. But there's also another kind of binding, which is called local binding. And that is how different features of experience get put together into unified gestalts within experience. So let's say if you see a blue square, red triangle, red qualia is locally bound to the triangle, whereas blue qualia is locally bound to the square. And you can kind of think of this as a network, really, kind of like where edges might represent local binding, Like, okay, there's like this gestalt of the square that is connected to, let's say, like a node that represents blue, for example. And you can kind of like maybe represent all of your experience as this network of relationships. In this metaphor, or very simplified model, local binding would be represented by edges, and then global binding would be represented by connected components. And essentially just the fact that there is a path from one node to another, even if it's like fairly indirect, would mean that they belong to the same experience. In that sense, okay, we could actually segment out experiences cleanly. There's kind of like a clear mathematical property that makes, you know, a particular piece of audio part of your experience as opposed to my experience, which would be, is this node part of this connected component or part of this other connected component? But there's like so much more too to binding. I mean, like once you kind of like start looking deep into it, for example, there's like binding via resonance, where if two, let's say like two figures in your visual field are oscillating at the same frequency, you will sense that there's some kind of connection between them. That's kind of like something that facilitates both of them kind of like clicking into the same gestalt. Or there's also like association by kind of like a threshold number of features. Like if there's like a painting and there's like two clusters that have kind of like the same texture, and textures are very difficult to describe, right? In the science of vision, they call them mongrels. Those two can essentially cause like a binding connection. And it feels like, well, actually both of those things are maybe part of the same dress, just different parts of the dress or something like that. And also there is like even things like, for example, when you perceive a fractal, right? Like if you see a fractal and you experience it as a gestalt, it's some very interesting kind of like binding that is cross scale, right? There's like maybe a hand and then a smaller hand in a different position, smaller hand, smaller hand, smaller hand. The whole gestalt feels kind of like unified in a particular way, even though that unification happens on different scales, right? Like, so it's not the case that binding has to happen within the same scale. You know, things can be of very different sizes and still be part of like the same kind of unified gestalt. So my claim is that this is actually very computationally useful. The fact that we can unify features of our experience is part of what makes consciousness computationally relevant. And this becomes very clear once you study binding disorders of all sorts. You know, there's, for example, simultagnosia is a kind of binding disorder where somebody cannot experience more than one gestalt at a time. It's actually enormously disabling. You know, they might see like this book, but while they're seeing the book, they cannot see, you know, the background. They cannot see like people. They cannot see where the book is located. So they can only, you know, focus one thing at a time. That is like enormously disabling. There's also like temporal binding disorders where, for example, there's the absence of movement. You cannot bind together like snapshots of experience with each other and kind of like paint a trajectory. In those cases, essentially everything looks frozen. You know, it's like that person is over there, now that person is over here, now that person is over there, but you don't actually see them move. And yeah, you know, they can survive, but they require aids, right? So if you think of like, okay, if you create an AGI, if you try to create an AGI, I would say, actually the constraints for it to have like true understanding are really, really strong, right? Like it would have to have like all of these different types of bindings so that when you have a conversation with it, you actually know that its internal representations have the same family of properties that actually gives it an understanding or something that resembles an understanding from our point of view. Okay, like maybe, and yeah, I'm very open to kind of like segue into an open-ended discussion for people to ask questions, but I'll just like mention what I think, and from the point of view of the Qualia Research Institute, like what is our solution to the binding problem? It's the following. I mean, essentially, if you have a picture of the universe where the universe is made of atoms and forces, the binding problem is literally impossible to solve. And I think this can be proven almost mathematically. So from many points of view, I mean, like a very, very simple argument would be that, you know, special relativity tells us that there's no universal plane of simultaneity, right? So actually, if you say, oh, well, binding is solved by neurons firing at the same time, you know, a neuron that encodes a square, a neuron that encodes blue, the fact that they fire simultaneously in synchrony means they're part of the same gestalt. Well, synchrony is actually a relative thing, right? Like it depends on how fast you're moving and in what direction. So there's actually no ground truth to whether two neurons are actually firing simultaneously or not. That's really kind of like if anything, is kind of like a fuzzy property. We saw exactly actually this problem with physics, where like in the 1800s, people had like enormous difficulty explaining electromagnetic phenomena in terms of atoms and forces. And in fact, there was like a lot of kind of like proofs that like, hey, the right-hand rule, for example, is impossible to derive from atoms and forces because you apply a force and it only goes in one direction. And so like, why is it the case that when you move all of this charge in that direction, you get like a force applied in the opposite? Is very, very strange and very puzzling, like what's going on there. The very big insight and solution by Maxwell and Faraday was realizing that the universe is made of fields. It's not made of atoms and forces. And in fact, if you have a kind of like a field theoretical lens on the universe, you realize that atoms and forces are emergent properties of the field. From the point of view of the field view of what's going on in electromagnetism, an electron is really kind of a manifestation of the field. It's essentially where field lines converge. And so really what you have is like equations that describe how the field lines evolve over time. And the electrons are really kind of like a manifestation of that. They're not like, ontologically kind of like the building blocks of reality. Really, the building block is this inherently connected field that evolves according to these differential equations. So I would claim that, when you transpose this to the problem of consciousness and binding, a lot of things start to make sense. So, okay, here's like the absolutely most outrageous woo thing that I'm going to probably say tonight, which is that I think the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness. And the equations of physics is actually describing the evolution of this field of consciousness. As such, actually the universe is inherently already interconnected, completely unified. But then you have a new problem, which is the boundary problem. If the universe is actually this gigantic field, how is it that I'm experiencing kind of this bundle of consciousness and you're experiencing a bundle of consciousness over there? So the solution that we have, and I will explain like briefly like all the features that it satisfies, but the solution that we have is topological segmentation. So here's the show and tell. So essentially the metaphor here is, imagine that the field of consciousness is like the surface of this balloon, right? If you twist it from both ends, there's a precise moment where it collapses and you get a pinch point. Now, obviously this is a physical thing, like, the pinch point is not like just a literal mathematical point, but when it comes to the fields and the evolution of fields, you would actually have, this collapsation of the dimensionality of it. And the moment you have actually something like a pinch point, you have this property that if you want to go from a point in this part of the field to a point in this other point of the field, you have to go through the pinch point, right? So all of a sudden, like the pinch point will function as kind of like a bottleneck of information and of energy and forces. And what's more, as in physics in general, things have their vibrational modes. If there are waves of energy in this field, and you have a pinch point, something that actually creates a topological boundary, it might function as a reflector of those waves. So all of a sudden, this part of the field will have its own natural resonant modes that are kind of expressions of its individuality. And it can act as a unit. I mean, it's like very similar to like a guitar. For example, the sound of a guitar is not, there's a common misconception, it's kind of like just the sound of the string. Actually, the sound of the guitar is the entire guitar vibrating, right? And like vibrations is one of the cases where the whole expresses itself in every single part, in every single like region of it. So that would be an example of a holism, where like in a very, very, very real sense, the whole is more than the sum of the parts because it acts as a unit. Okay, so revisiting the question, why would these solve many of the problems in consciousness is that topological segments of the fields, because they can trap energy and because they can have their own natural resonant modes, essentially would be something that could be computationally useful, would be something that evolution would have a reason to recruit, because it can act as a unit, it can coordinate all of this huge nervous system to behave as just one thing. And I think like that can be useful for all sorts of things, for coherence of action, evaluating damage or well-being, essentially kind of like getting an objective function of how well you're doing as a whole, and many other properties. So I'll just list the properties, happy to dive deeper into this. But essentially, we claim that the solution to the binding problem that we propose has desirable properties such as it is compatible with modern physics. I mean, the idea that the fields segment out into these topological pockets is not incompatible with physics. In fact, it's studied in physics. It's called the cohomology of the electromagnetic field. And there's like a lot of research on that. And there's like a lot of phenomena that simply do not make sense in physics unless you take into account the topological segmentation in the field. It also avoids epiphenomenalism, right? Because all of a sudden the unity of consciousness actually has an effect, right? Like is not epiphenomenal. And also you avoid what's called strong emergence, right? It's not the case that like, well, at this level of complexity, consciousness emerges all of a sudden. Like, no, consciousness was there to begin with. The thing that happened is that it got segmented out into something now is a natural unit. So those are, some of the key properties. To wrap up these in the context of AI and AGI, I do think it is possible to create sentient AGIs, sentient intelligences, artificial intelligence, but they will require a different kind of hardware, a completely different paradigm, not a classical von Neumann architecture. Because with the current kinds of digital computer architectures that we have, they're not actually using the holism of the field for any kind of computation. Really, you're segmenting it out into like all of these like tiny transistors where like there's like a yes or no answer, a 1 or a 0. And the computation is happening at that level. At no point you have kind of like an aggregated, integrated segment of the field that it's acting as a unit and is being used for anything holistically. However, there are some experimental, cutting-edge hardware that do use these, such as what's called nonlinear optical computers. And some of these have been demonstrated as actually being capable of solving things like the Ising problem, constraint satisfaction problems in extremely, extremely efficient ways. Where, yeah.
Is that the same thing as like spiking neural nets or MRISTers, or is that different?
It would be different, yeah. And especially, if you, if the behavior of it can be accounted for as just kind of like, well, fiddling with synaptic weights, even though it's, like maybe a continuous in a sense, that would still not satisfy the constraints of the binding problem. Maybe I'll just like say like why the brain is different. So like the final thing I'll mention before like opening it up is that in neuroscience, classically people think of, okay, what is the probability for a neuron to fire? Is a function of like what are the synaptic inputs that it is experiencing at a particular moment in time. But it turns out that actually doesn't account for the full behavior of a neuron. And it's called variance in neuroscience. Like, why does this neuron fire even though it didn't have like synaptic inputs? Well, there's this other thing that is called emphatic coupling. And in particular, the one that I think is the most relevant is called like local field potentials, which is that essentially the probability that a neuron will fire is a function of both what synaptic inputs it's getting and also what is the aggregate statistical population level activity in its surroundings. Why? Because that changes the electric gradient around it. And that as a consequence changes what is the threshold, how much of a synaptic input it needs to get in order to fire. Now local field potentials, they don't change the probability that much for neurons to fire. Depending on who you ask, it's estimated between like 3%, 20% as much as synaptic inputs. But the one thing that they do have an enormous influence on is the probability for neurons to fire in synchrony. And if you think about it, one of the things that you can absolutely control with your mind is the synchrony of different aspects of your experience. And this is maybe a take-home like experiment you can run. I guarantee you will see something interesting, which is like literally choose any two parts of your body. Like it could be your eyelid and like, I don't know, your like toe or literally any two parts of your body. And for 5 minutes, try to pay attention to both of them at once. And just do that for 5 minutes. by the clock, like do spend some 5 minutes doing it, you will notice how there's going to be kind of like waves of vibration in those two parts that eventually will synchronize and they will become kind of a unified gestalt. I would suspect that, yeah, this is actually local field potentials at work. Like you're spreading kind of this patchwork of a local field potential that makes those regions of the brain actually synchronize. And so, hey, that is consciousness doing something. It's not epiphenomenal. And of course, yeah, if you take it all the way, you get to the, the jhanas and the stages of insight and all of those like stages of like super synchrony and hypercoherence and extremely trippy stuff. It's kind of just like taking the same algorithm all the way through, just like synchronize different parts of your experience until you get those explosive emergent experiences. And I think, yeah, that's demonstration consciousness is definitely not epiphenomenal. It's definitely a holistic thing. And current hardware architectures will not take us there. So, yes.
First of all, can everyone on the stream hear me right now? This is our question mic. Yes, okay, they can. So I'm going to start with some of these questions here, but then I'm also going to pass the mic around so that everyone else can have some, but I'm going to kind of work my way backwards through a few. Is there a way that you could empirically test the idea that there's like a field of consciousness?
Yeah.
And if so, what is it?
Huge number of ways to test it. So just give you an example. One of the kind of like early theories of electromagnetic theories of consciousness, Susan Pocket, she came up with like a bunch of like experimental tests of these. One would be essentially like canceling out the local field potentials of parts of the brain. So what you could do is like essentially embed a part of your brain, let's say like one that, let's say, encodes like color perception or some particular binding into a visual field, and essentially measure its local fields and essentially add the inverse of it. So you will cancel out the local field. The prediction here is like, well, not only you will get like a different effect, but you will literally have kind of like it doesn't mean like you will be like a piece of black or a piece of white on your visual field. It's like more like a blind spot. Like there will be like a missing piece of your visual field. Again, you may not be able to like notice it right away, but you could do an experiment where like, okay, like you should be seeing a red square here, but actually you're not experiencing a red square at all. So like essentially adding the inverse of a patch of a local field would be one way. Another way is essentially with technologies like, well, you can imagine like the iteration of Neuralink or something like that, where what you do is essentially you take kind of like a slice of the brain and kind of like measure its inputs and outputs in terms of synaptic activity, and you replace it by a transistor-based system. And the prediction here is that, okay, yes, you would be able to map inputs to outputs in terms of synapses, but depending on the electrical properties of that, circuit, you may be able to block any kind of like emphatic coupling between one side or the other. And the prediction here is that, yeah, you would have like some severe binding disorders as a consequence. There's like even more exotic stuff. I mean, like the sort of thing I'd love to actually test is like, so it's very clearly the case that there is a top-down influence of the electromagnetic field of neural activity, and you can show these with a transcranial magnetic stimulation. TMS is being used for all sorts of therapies. But TMS, I mean, a very important thing is like the typical clinical application of TMS is pulsed, essentially kind of like these big, kind of like spikes. Why? Because when they've tried it with what's called like repetitive or sinusoidal TMS, it's very likely that you get seizures, essentially. But the fact that you're actually getting seizures by inducing a magnetic field on your brain indicates that you're like talking the language of your brain. Now, the kind of like more exotic kinds of tests here, especially with kind of like a topological theory of binding, is that TMS is not just like inducing a magnetic field. It's also essentially kind of like sending something that has a particular topology. And my prediction, and okay, this is very out there, but I would expect in 10, 20 years, there's going to be such a thing as like topological TMS, where like you're actually care not only about like how intense the magnetic field is, you also care about what is the shape of it. And I would predict that, yeah, the shape would like massively change, like binding properties. Like you could focus a topological TMS on somebody and then like have that, the person might have the illusion that they're having a telepathic conversation of somebody because they're getting like local binding between their avatar and somebody else. So all of those kind of tests would be ways of showing this.
I'll do another one and then I'll pass it around.
Yeah.
Just kind of going back a little bit. Actually, no, I'll do the really fun one, which is, do you think GPT-3 is conscious at all?
No, it would be what's called a micro-experiential zombie. In other words, I mean, the whole setup, the whole computer rack is made of mind dust. So like it is like specks of qualia, but actually at no point it aggregates into any kind of unified experience. And if it does aggregate into at least like maybe some significant patches of experience, the intentional content, the semantics of whatever those patches are experiencing have nothing to do with what the algorithm is nominally solving.
Could a multimodal foundation model avoid the binding problem?
No, it wouldn't be able, because it would still, at the implementation level, would never actually use holistic behavior of fields. It still segments it out into transistors. So it really wouldn't matter.
Okay, I'm going to pass this around if anyone
All right,
has any.
yes. I guess speaking to the microphone. Yeah.
Just kind of hold it like here, yeah.
I was just going to say, going the other way, do you think that anything that does have that property of some kind of topological singularity or whatever is conscious, basically?
Yes.
Or so anything that has a large-scale synchronization?
Yeah, synchronization doesn't do it, but topological segmentation does. And yeah, I mean, these makes predictions that are very strange, but I do think like they're true. So like, for example, the sun. The sun is not a unified entity because it's actually segmented out into pockets that are topologically closed, like plasma cells, as they call them. And these, again, like, okay, actually, like, when people are skeptical of, like, is the topology of the field in any way relevant for us? Actually, yes, solar flares. Like, solar flares arise when this phenomena called magnetic reconnection happens, where you had, like, a tube of plasma that was actually being topologically confined by the field, gets opened up or squashed or sheared, and just, like, the tube of plasma ejects this massive amount of plasma. So that's actually a topological change. Is like actually changing how the field lines are connected. I mean, I recommend check out like magnetic reconnection, Wikipedia. There's a very nice animation. So I would predict essentially, yeah, like wherever you have the field lines loop around, such as like in big plasma cells in the sun, you will have a very large experience. Now, I don't think the sun is intelligent. I don't think it actually has intentional content. It doesn't have like the kind of feelings that we have, but it might be these like very huge macroscopic experiences.
Actually, the discussion on the sun segues nicely into what I wanted to ask, which was from an astronomy point of view, one of the fundamental assumptions is that the laws of physics and the distribution of matter is consistent throughout the universe. Introducing this field, would you speculate this follows the same property? And if not so, is this basically your answer to the Fermi paradox?
So to clarify, the theory here is that the fields of physics are actually fields of qualia. So I'm not like proposing that there's like an additional field of consciousness. I'm saying like, no, what physics is studying is actually consciousness from the outside. And yeah, I mean like, yeah, the cosmological principle, I think it's called, like, yeah, that there is some like, at a certain scale, everything is actually uniformly distributed. I do think it is the case. My suspicion about like what's going on with the Fermi paradox is just that life is actually pretty unlikely, and you need like very special, rare thermodynamical events for it to get started. So like we may be alone in the entire Hubble volume. Like the observable universe may only have us as life. But I also take quite seriously reasoning based on the anthropic principle, and maybe you've encountered like grabby aliens by Robin Hanson. Well, he argues that, yeah, we probably, I mean, we're just like very early. We are kind of like on the afterglow of the Big Bang relative to like how long the universe will be able to host life. So he infers based on that actually there probably is quite a bit of life, but we're just like one of the very early ones. And we're actually probably going to expand close to the speed of life and swallow up most of the matter in the, essentially, yeah, like the universe would be colonized by these like seeds of intelligent life, and we're just like one of the early ones. I mean, one point though is like, within the grabby aliens paradigm, I do think actually many of the super civilizations out there may actually be made of philosophical zombies. And that's like a risk that we have. I mean, like, AGI doesn't need to be conscious for it to be really powerful. I would actually reframe that a lot of what we're doing with AI today is not like true intelligence, because intelligence in my book requires the exploration, manipulation, and understanding of consciousness, which is definitely not doing. They're more kind of like power tools. They're like tools that can achieve strong, big causal effects in a directed fashion. And yeah, I mean, I think it's possible to destroy life on Earth with an AI. And it doesn't have to be conscious to be extremely dangerous.
All right, I got another one from the stream. If universal topology plays such an important role in consciousness, does this imply that animals like octopi with multiple brains aren't conscious or have multiple consciousnesses?
It may very well be. I mean, that is kind of the topological account of the boundary problem. Would give us a principled way to tell whether non-human animals have unified consciousness. And my guess is like, yeah, I mean, most animals with a nervous system do have unified consciousness on some level. You can look at like the mini brain of like a bumblebee or like an ant, and it really does seem so far like the evidence is consistent with that. They actually do have kind of like a tiny world simulation, and like they have like a tiny avatar within it, and like, an ant actually is kind of like living in its own virtual world, and it is a full conscious entity, just made of like very little qualia. It's just not a very rich experience or intense experience like ours, but it is, yeah, morally very relevant. It can still suffer. Yeah, I don't know about octopi. I guess I haven't studied their neurology very much, but if we were to be able to visualize at a high enough resolution the topology of the electromagnetic field, if it turns out that there are like 3 topological pockets, then yeah, I would say it's probably made of like 3 subjects of experience. It would be very strange, yeah. But then again, like that might also happen with, for example, split brain patients, where like split brain patients literally may actually have like 2 large topological pockets that are in competition with one another. That may actually happen, I guess, like a segue also into like multiple personality disorder, because, kind of like to enrich your concept of like what's going on in the brain, local binding connections in the topological model would essentially be things like a reconnection. So it's kind of like your experience actually is touching itself from multiple points of view. And so like, sorry for the noise, like actually like a rich experience like the one that you're having would be one where the field is actually like wrapping around and like touching itself in multiple ways. And so there's actually kind of like wormholes inside you that connect different parts of your experience. I think like something like multiple personality disorder, when it's actually serious, would be where like these kind of like internal reconnections accidentally created a global boundary, which is like you also have a pinch point within you. Now, this would still create like a very, very intimate relationship between the various alters of somebody with multiple personality disorder. And there's like, yeah, these very crazy anecdotes of somebody with, multiple personalities, that one personality saw their dream from one point of view and the other saw the same dream from a different point of view. So my sense is like, yeah, you can have kind of like deep emotional cognitive intimacy with your alters, but maybe there's still like global boundary between them. And maybe with octopi, it might be like that. Like, hey, yeah, there's different subjects of experience, but they're like very intimately connected with each other regardless, because they share boundaries.
How do I know that I am not a philosophical zombie?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a rabbit hole, but like, I do find that some people have like a very big difficulty, for example, even locating what do we mean by a particular qualia, right? So like, I don't know, my estimation would be something like 80% of people, when you like say like, okay, maybe when you were a kid, you wonder like, is the blue that I see the same blue that you see? You know, like a good solid 80% of people say like, yes, actually I did wonder that at some point, and like that was weird. I thought like, okay, it's impossible to answer, and I just moved on. I think the percentage for something like the binding problem is like lower. You know, maybe like, I think like 20% of people kind of like get it right away. And I do think, yeah, there's a good percentage of people, especially people on the autism spectrum, for whom like locating the internal referent of qualia is very, very difficult. And also the binding problem is like very, very difficult as well. And I think this has to do with like the attention and awareness style. Like if the way you perceive the world is kind of just like a lot of like quick fixation points of attention, realizing like paying attention to a gestalt is much more difficult. So it's more kind of like, yeah, you might need the right drug or the right meditation to really get it, I think. Cool. Anybody else?
I was curious about the puzzles.
Oh yeah, the phenomenal puzzle. Yes. Well, I'm gonna gift you. These are the stickers of the Qualia Research Institute, if people want.
Oh yeah, there was a question earlier, which was, what was the like reasoning behind these kind of like sniff things
I think one.
for QRI?
Yeah. So the relevance is, well, here's one. There's a bunch of reasons, right? But one of them is like, okay, like being able to say like new, meaningful, non-trivial things about something like scent is a certain kind of very strange test of consciousness, right? So, and it's very relevant for us because, in particular, the state space of scent seems to be a very irregular, has an irregular geometry. There's like a lot of like interesting kind of like corner cases in the state space of scent. And so it's like a really good example of like, hey, can we say like new, meaningful, non-trivial things about consciousness that maybe other people cannot because they gave up too early? And you know, when it comes to, for example, something like mapping out the geometry of DMT experiences, you know, the typical response when somebody kind of like sees our research in that domain is, well, I just don't believe you. Right? It's like, yeah, sure, you're saying these things, you're saying like, there's like 6 levels, and the level 4, it has these mathematical properties, but how do I know you're right? I think like showing that, well, something much more familiar, like the state space of scent, is something that like, there's actually a lot of rich information that we can talk about, and once you kind of like see it, you cannot unsee, is a way of kind of give you an intuition that, yeah, actually, likewise, something much more exotic, like levels of DMT, sure, you can have like thousands of people having gone through it and just not having paid attention to it in the right way, that they will say something new and meaningful about it. But with the right paradigm, you can actually go really far.
So on the QRI website, kind of talks about your own story of doing some DMT and meeting this entity that you met with a number of times.
Oh, I said a psychonaut reported that.
Oh,
But
okay.
Yes.
I was just curious about like the meetings with that entity.
Sure. So I am agnostic about the reality of external reality of DMT entities. I think it's unlikely that they're independent. I mean, I think they're like projections of your own mind. My current like thinking about them is that they are essentially projections of sociodynamic landscapes. I mean, this sounds like, you know, if you're like meditating on like loving kindness, you know, you've spent like the last week on a loving kindness retreat, and you take DMT, you will very likely go to a world where like everybody is like embedded in pure love and like they're loving each other, and you know, very, very beautiful experience. If you've been, I guess, like for the last week, I don't know, yeah, let's say like in LA or something. Yeah, you might have like, you know, like intense like jesters and clowns full of kind of like narcissistic energy. Like there's like, So like, I mean, I think like if you train or I guess, yeah, like it really depends on like what sociodynamic landscapes you've been in training your mind with. It doesn't mean that you have that energy in you. It just means that you're perceptually expecting it, such that in our theory, essentially they become like energy sinks and your consciousness gets trapped into that way of perceiving the world. Yeah, I mean, like there's, I don't know, like I'm very grateful. I mean, essentially, you know, since putting kind of like the the beacon of like, hey, we're interested in the geometry of this stuff. A lot of people have like reached out over the years, like sharing with me like really strange things that have happened to them, and like that's why I'm like, I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not like smugly say like, no, they're all just hallucinations, because there's also some very strange things that happen to some people. But there's no like, you know, foolproof concrete evidence of it so far that I know of. Yeah. But I guess like, yeah, something to say about this, like a very key distinction, and we have an article about this, which is like the difference between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. You know, superficially it sounds like they're maybe the same thing or like very slight variations of the same drug. They actually couldn't be more different, right? So DMT, they call it the spirit molecule because you meet all of these like crazy entities and different like frequencies of consciousness and like realms and so on. Extremely high diversity of qualia. 5-MeO DMT, essentially it unifies the mind and you experience kind of like a profound sense of oneness, and it's like a very, very reliable effect. In our account, actually, this is a qualitative difference that emerges out of a quantitative difference. So let me explain. So if you have like a bunch of like, you know, classic pendulum clocks in a wall, if you have like just like 10 of them, you know, they're actually like sending micro vibrations through the wall. After like an hour or so, the pendulum will actually synchronize. They enter into a state of resonance. If you have like 10,000 of them in a huge wall, at no point they actually synchronize. Like at best, what you will see is like spontaneous like clusters of synchrony, or maybe a traveling wave of synchrony. But they're just like too sparsely connected for them to actually all of them synchronize. But now start adding connections to them, you know, literal physical connections between them. You will see two phase transitions. First, you will see a phase transition where you have like competing clusters of synchrony. Where like, whoa, like every clock is actually part of some cluster of other clocks that are synchronized, but they're not synchronized at a global level. If you add even more connections, you essentially get to another threshold where you get a phase transition where they actually all of them synchronize. I think the difference between DMT and 5-MeO DMT is like that. Essentially, they both shorten the average synaptic path length of the brain, would be, you know, a way of saying like they both make your brain more interconnected. But DMT does it only to the point where you get to these like competing clusters of coherence level of interconnectivity. 5-MeO DMT takes you all the way to the one unified state of coherence. And yeah, this is very relevant for a lot of things. I mean, I think like DMT is much more powerful when it comes to computation. It's like, I think like, you know, future mathematicians who study consciousness will probably discover a lot of things by studying DMT, because like the complex interactions between these competing clusters of coherence can process information in a very crazy way that I think like goes way beyond what classical computers can do. But from the point of view of valence, for like how good or bad experiences feel, I think 5-MeO DMT is far more relevant, because the most blissful, loving, joyful, peaceful experiences tend to involve these global coherence. So my guess would be something like our descendants will probably inhabit something by default much closer to 5-MeO DMT, but then use something like DMT states for computation. And DMT entities, from this perspective, they're kind of like clusters of coherence that are in this like crazy evolutionary process. They're competing for your attention. And if you feed the right kind of attention, they can actually solve problems for you. In that sense, they are a kind of superintelligence, but they're a baby superintelligence of your own making. And so I don't find it that surprising that people say like, wow, yeah, like that entity like was super intelligent in a very strange way. But it's like, yeah, it's just kind of like talking to a baby superintelligence. It's not yet mature, right? Like a very different story would be like if you've spent like 20 years in that state and actually have like fiddle with the weights so that it's actually doing something useful.
It was quite freaky when I read about it the first time. So apparently you can tell your mind that it has an entity living in it, and an entire personality develops in your brain, which becomes your friend and can become your enemy and all sorts of things.
Yeah.
So would you consider that to be an actual consciousness, or at what level is it, and why is it living in someone's brain like that, and where is its brain, and so on?
Yeah.
I don't know what the term is for this thing. I
Tulpa.
forgot. Huh?
Tulpa.
Yes.
A tulpa.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely, a lot of people say like, I know, well, okay, I don't want to be, I should probably be diplomatic, right? But like something like, I know my particular God is real because I feel it. And like, whenever I ask my God for whatever, like it's there and I have this feeling and it's like full of love and like, okay. The problem with the epistemology there is that, well, if you've been training your brain to expect kind of like that entity over years and adding a lot of emotion and a lot of what we call like annealing at QRI, yeah, essentially you will kind of like have created this like simulation of an entity inside you. In our model, that would be essentially a local binding effect. So like, it is not that it has its own experience, it's more that you have segmented out your experience. Rather like, again, like if you think of your experience as kind of like a network, where each node is a particular speck of consciousness and each edge is a local binding connection. When you have a tulpa, really it's not that you have like a separate graph. You don't have like a separate connected component. It's still part of the same component. They're globally bound. But it is dissociated from your sense of self. And so you're experiencing as another. I think that has a lot to do with essentially the flow of attention. I mean, like literally there is like usually a center of attention, which is how we represent ourselves. And within our world simulation, we send waves of energy into various aspects of our experience, and anything it bounces off of, we code it as other. And so like as long as you're relating to a tulpa in that way, you're gonna experience it as an other. But yeah, this breaks down in other states of consciousness. Like, for example, if you've been cultivating a tulpa for a while and then you take ketamine at a high enough dose, you may become one with it, for example. So like the idea that like, no, it's actually like a separate entity can break down if you mess with the local binding parameters. But yeah, to be clear, I specifically don't think it has like a consciousness of its own.
How does it, because it can be angry with you and disappointed with you.
Yeah.
And that's freaky because
Yeah.
if it does not have a consciousness of its own, you should be able to access whatever consciousness it has, right?
Well,
The hardware is the same, essentially, is what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of like you're using the same hardware with which you represent other people, right? Yeah, so internal representations of other entities are kind of like accounts, accounts in a social network or something like that. Or I guess like think of object-oriented programming or something like that. Like you're keeping things inside them. And particular emotional tones can get stuck in them. In our theory, essentially, the particular emotional tone of an internal representation is a function of its vibrational modes. I mean, we're trying to formalize a lot of things that hippies would have been talking about for a while, kind of like the vibe of somebody. Which in our model actually is like a combination of like what are their like consonant, dissonant, and noise components of their vibratory modes. And this is something you can explore. Like if you are talking to a tulpa that is angry with you, you will notice that like the kind of energy that is emitting. I mean, again, like I don't think it's like outside your brain. It's like everything is inside it. The kind of like way in which is vibrating is going to be sending spiky and dissonant wavefronts that are very sharp and destructive. Whereas like if the tulpa is actually very loving, it's going to be sending harmonious, soft waves. And so for example, yeah, if you had like a very angry tulpa and then you take MDMA, MDMA will change the medium of wave propagation inside your consciousness such that very soft waves get favored. And as a consequence, yeah, your tupa will all of a sudden be very loving, for example. It might not be able to have the anger it had before because the kind of waves that exist in that neural environment are very, very euphoric and positive. Yeah.
Cool. Well, I want to thank you, Andres, for joining us today. And that was just a really cool conversation and
Thank
talk.
you.
So that was really fun.
Thank you for having me.